I have three things for us to consider today before we even get to the notes that we're working through. Is Jay here? Okay, well, I'm going to sit down. There's going to be a little something take place before we start.
Just don't take your spots.
Just don't let
Take their spots.
steal the chair from my
Yeah.
Can you get me in here?
I think you were kind of there. So it's
Tell us just a little bit about your military experience.
Oh, well, I grew up in a Mennonite background, so we were pacifists, and it was a very long time for me to kind of come to grasp that was not my personal belief. And by then I was in my mid-20s, and I had quite a bit of college debt, which was a great burden on me. And I did some research, and I decided to join the infantry so that I thought that would be the most of what a soldier is. I thought, if I'm going to join the Army, I should actually learn what a soldier is. So, joined the Oregon Guard and was infantry for 6 years, air assault, and paid for my college. I was just telling Seaside, I still use my benefits. I recently bought a house, and I love the Oregon National Guard.
Okay. So what years were you in that?
87 till 93.
87 to 93.
Yep.
Well, thank you for your service. Okay.
All right. Today I don't know how much progress we're going to make in terms of the material that we're currently going through, which is the lesson on abortion. And the reason for this is that, the news continues to happen, and we haven't met in a couple of weeks, and there has been a lot that has happened, partly because the Supreme Court has finished their session for the year, and so various decisions that have come out. And some of these, I think, are really worth our time to consider. And so we'll start doing that today, and we'll see how far we get. We might get into the abortion material before we're done. We'll just see. But the first thing I wanted to make mention of is critical race theory in public schools. And we've talked about that before. And so we're just giving an update as to where that is at right now. One of the podcasts that I listen to is The World and Everything in It. How many of you listen to that podcast? Okay. What's that? You hear snippets from it? So if you listen to that podcast, this piece, you probably heard this, but John Stonestreet is interviewed on The World and Everything in It. I think it's Friday, right? And so this was just a couple of days ago. The American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, those are the two big teachers' unions in the United States. And some of you are teachers or retired teachers, so you would know more about those unions probably than I would. But critical race theory was a hot topic at these two events. And so I just want to read a bit of this to you. The one big story that came out is that the unions say they are ready to fight local parent activists or non-woke school boards. And this is according to Education Week. Both unions, the AFT and the NEA, are, quote, vowing to defend their members against any backlash over how they teach on the subject of race. And so Stonestreet just has an interesting comment. It's part of a much larger statement, but I think this is worth just pointing out to you. He says there's a great irony here, because we were just told for the last 3 weeks that the whole fear over critical race theory being mandated and taught in schools was made up and really not even an issue. And then we have these two teachers' unions essentially saying, oh, no, it really is a big deal, and we're going to enforce it on everybody. And so if you pay attention to the news, what Stonestreet says here, I think is accurate. I agree with his assessment of this. We've heard a lot over the last several weeks and really months from the teachers' unions that critical race theory is not really being taught in our schools. It's really not a concern. This is just overblown. This is parents who don't know what they're talking about. And now all of a sudden, there's been a complete reversal, and they themselves are saying this is an issue. That's an interesting humming noise with a ringing phone. Oh, so, okay. So I don't know if anybody has any comments on that. I just wanted to give that as a brief update. Some of you, we've got a school board member. We've got Kelly, who's education district. So some of you are involved in education in various ways. Any comments on that at all?
There was, I think it was Epic Times this week had a deal, and it was I'm not sure what the lady was from, it was a black lady, I think it was like Michigan or something. She stood up at one of the council meetings and they put her down and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, but at the end she said, we're ready to fight, bring it on. And I thought, hey, that's pretty cool, because it's a black lady But it's kind of, maybe it would be on the other side of the fence, I mean, from what race theory.
Yeah, and I guess I should add that, obviously race in American history is a serious matter, and the story, much of it is pretty ugly. I just reread Frederick Douglass' narrative. I don't know if you've read that before. Probably it's required reading in a lot of schools, or in the past anyway. And Frederick Douglass was a contemporary of like Abraham Lincoln, and was a slave in Maryland, and eventually learned to read, and then eventually escaped slavery and came to the North. And you read that narrative and you read the life that he experienced in the South, and you also read his opinion of Christianity as he experienced it in the South. Douglass was not opposed to Christianity. I would say he was a Christian. But his writing is powerful, and so I'm just acknowledging that. We need to acknowledge that. The problem isn't being honest about race. I think the problem is when you take race and add it to a more Marxist worldview, and you put that together, and it becomes something that I think is really destructive. We need to be really honest about race in our country, and need to be honest about racism really throughout human history, and slavery throughout human history, and the depravity of the human heart, But when you take racism and put it together with Marxism, that's a really toxic, I think, dangerous situation.
I think there would be a couple of thoughts on what you just said. First is, school districts receive money based on the number of children they have in their school district. And one of the things that we are seeing in this instance, as this becomes more and more of an issue, all of the things, Black Lives Matter, this critical race theory that's being shoved down people's throats, we're seeing more people take their children from public schools. Also, the other aspect of this is we're seeing more, it's not really heavy yet, but there's more and more teachers and professional educators that are leaving both the American Federation of Teachers and the NEA. And quite frankly, the American Federation of Teachers is much larger than the NEA. And so it's putting people and putting school districts at peril if they continue to do this. In the state of Oregon, it is creeping in gradually. And as I said before, Portland now has sponsored a couple symposiums concerning critical race theory. And it just separates our state. And as we've mentioned before, we've got the West against the East.
Mm-hmm.
So we've also got the teachers, a lady that's kind of staying with us right now. Her daughter-in-law was a teacher in Hermiston. She's cut ties and wanted to echo.
There is a book, the elders have read this book, and I really do recommend the book, Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. Any of you heard of that book or read that book? He has a chapter on education and just looking forward and concerned with where the culture is going, and he really does advocate for lots of other options, whether it's private schools, classical Christian schools, homeschooling, or combinations of those certainly in school districts where this sort of stuff has taken over. And I do think at some point Christians do have to ask those questions and think seriously about, do we keep our kids in a school system that is fundamentally undermining our values? And not only on this issue, but the LGBTQ issue is even, I think, a bigger problem. And the answers, or the problems are real and the answers are hard, right? Because there's financial challenges, there's lots of challenges to all of that.
The status in Stanfield and Hermiston, I didn't hear you remark that.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm assuming that we're in Eastern Oregon, and so this stuff is prevalent here. But I don't know that, and I don't know if there's a difference between Hermiston and Stanfield and Echo. There could be. I mean, I think Hermiston would be maybe more more vulnerable to some of this. Is a larger district. But Lloyd, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of Echo?
It's not going to happen.
What's that? Not going to happen in Echo? Yeah.
I would say that I would predict that you would see it show up more likely the bigger the school is.
Yeah. The bigger the school district, the more professional people in the school district, and the closer you are to a university.
And it comes from more diverse backgrounds and different
Yeah.
upbringings and things like that.
Yeah. Well, the second one that I want to just update you on, and again, we've talked about this topic and about this individual specifically, and that is Burinell Stutzman, and she owns a florist business in Tri-Cities, Washington, so really quite local. And this is also from the World and Everything in it for July 8th. And I'll read a few highlights here, or what I've highlighted. By review, the case involves a florist in Washington State who referred a gay couple elsewhere rather than create customized floral arrangements for their wedding. To do so would violate her religious belief that marriage is between a man and a woman. And so this individual, who's a senior citizen, she's probably she might be in her 70s now. She has had people on her, she's employed people who are LGBTQ. She doesn't have any problems employing people, and I don't think she should in her business. She also, when she was approached, it's been many years ago now, it was before the Obergefell decision that made same-sex marriage legal in the United States, but Washington made it legal in the state back, I think, in 2013. So it's 2013, 2014 where this all started for her. So she had a customer come into her business, and she knew this customer. She'd known the person for years. She had served the person for years, but the person announced that he was marrying his boyfriend and wanted her to cater or to do the flowers for the wedding. She said she couldn't do that based upon her religious convictions, and she referred him to other florists who would serve him. That got into the courts. And so that's some background. Let me read this. Burinell Stutzman has a flower shop called Arlene's Flowers in Washington State. Well, here's the review I just gave you. Yes, in 2013, a gay customer that she had had for a number of years and served came in and wanted a customized floral arrangement for a same-sex wedding. Now, Miss Stutzman serves gay customers and sells some flowers off the shelf, but in this case, she was asked to design something, an arrangement, and she declined. She also explained why, and that information got to the Washington State Attorney General, who brought a civil rights complaint against her. The Washington Supreme Court, ultimately ruled against her, and she had to take it to the Supreme Court of the United States for review. The court basically sent it back to Washington Supreme Court, asking the court to take another look at it after the Masterpiece cake shop decision. You remember what I'm talking about? In Colorado. So that decision, the court said that there was religious discrimination against the baker. And so he won. It was a very limited victory. That was Jack Phillips. That decision was by the Supreme Court back in 2018. It said that Jack Phillips had been discriminated against by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. So given that decision, the Supreme Court of the United States sent this back to Washington State and said, you need to review this. Because in the Colorado decision, they were openly hostile to his religious beliefs. So anyway, it went back to the Washington Supreme Court, so they reviewed it and came to the same decision, said we're not making any changes in what we've decided, we're holding her responsible. And so Well, let's see. You know, one of the things I think is important to emphasize is that it is not a matter of Stutzman or Jack Phillips refusing to serve LGBTQ customers. It's a matter of creating a custom piece of artwork to celebrate something that they find deeply troubling as far as their religious beliefs go. The couple in Stutzman case could have chosen any number of other businesses and so forth. Skipping down here. So what did the Supreme Court say? Well, they did not take her case. And so what does that mean? Well, it leaves in place the lower court ruling that found that she violated a state civil rights law that bars discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. It probably means that she'll have to design floral arrangements for same-sex weddings if she does any weddings at all. I guess you could say that if she doesn't design floral arrangements for weddings at this point, she can do that. But I don't think that ends the issue, because I expect the next complaint will be a refusal to design a custom arrangement for a gender transition celebration, and I'm not sure there's any easy way out of it one way or the other for her. You know, the other thing that's sad is that she's likely liable for extensive attorney fees and costs that the state has incurred for pursuing her for all these years. So the Supreme Court would not take her case, and so the lower court decision stands, and so she lost. And so Jack Phillips won his case, but the reason he won is because the court said there was clearly religious animus against him. In this case, with the Florissant Tri-Cities, the court said there isn't religious animus, and so the Washington decision stands. And so she's now on the horns of a dilemma. She's, I think, exhausted her case in terms of what she can do legally and through the courts. And so I think she's facing a situation, I don't know how much, I assume the fees are substantial. You know, could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. I don't know that. There was no money figure here, although there is mention made of the sweet cakes situation in Oregon several years ago. The state fined that individual $135,000. Our state did. Now, in Washington, I don't think the fines are nearly that steep, but the legal fees are probably very steep. So I think this Florissant Washington state is probably, kind of doomed.
During that fund?
Well, I was going to suggest...
Church as a whole stand behind individuals too. I'm not just saying Stanfield Baptist, like...
Then there might be, I'm sure that her own legal representation was probably free, because there are organizations that are fighting for religious liberty who I'm sure took up her case and did that, pro bono. So her indebtedness would be whatever the other side's legal fees are. And I hope that, I mean, the Christian community, I think Jack Phillips and this woman, we should honor them for the fight that they've been waging that is really on all of our behalf. And so if you're in Washington, if you're up there, if nothing else, go buy flowers from her.
She attends Richmond Baptist Church. She attends Richmond Baptist.
Is that a Southern Baptist church?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've wondered where she goes to church. I didn't know that. But she is, if you see her, she must be in her 70s. She's not a young person, and she's paying a pretty heavy price.
That article also says the New York that she would tell them anything from the case, and there's no issue there. And I'm curious. I was listening to the article and I've heard stories, but it doesn't sound like the couple actually sued, but the Washington state came in and took up the case. And I don't see how that can't be the same as the Colorado case. I don't have any. But it's not really surprising that the Washington Supreme Court sides with the Washington government in that case. It's just not. It's not surprising that way. That's the way it goes.
There were a couple other hands that went up.
Yeah, I was really disturbed about this. This is probably one of the most horrendous decisions ever delivered. only 3 justices said, yes, we should hear this, and that, of course, was Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch. What happened to Kavanaugh and Barrett? And, of course,
And even Roberts at some level, because he is,
and I feel that they've
Yeah.
been cowed. Kavanaugh and Barrett has 7 children, and Kavanaugh, I don't know, he has several. But
yeah.
to me, it's just a travesty, because what they said is religious conscience doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court, to review a case, there had to be 4 justices agree to it, and they only had 3. So, if Kavanaugh or Barrett or Roberts had said, it was within their power to one of any of those 3 to say, let's review this case, and it would have been reviewed. And they chose not to. And so they chose to really just dodge the issue. And again, something we talked about months ago, that, because I think too, the secular culture, there's so many folks in Stanfield that this whole discussion wouldn't make any sense to them. It really wouldn't. They would view the florists as just bigoted to have a problem with serving the gay couple. And I think it's helpful, the concept of dignitary harm, which we talked about months ago, because that's one of the major arguments that is being used by the other side on this. That if you don't serve me, if you don't agree with me, you're doing dignitary harm to me. You're stripping me of my dignity. You're making me feel bad about myself. And yet, so often that argument isn't applied evenly or fairly, because dignitary harm goes both ways. So for agree or disagree with a Jack Phillips or a Stutzman, their conscience is violated by the thought of being involved in a homosexual marriage because they believe that this dishonors God. Okay, you can agree or disagree with that. But I think in our society there should be a recognition that to force an individual to violate their deep-held religious convictions does do dignitary harm to that individual. It strips them of their dignity. And so it's just, I think it's a very sad situation that we are in. And it in my mind, it raises this sort of specter as to where the court maybe is leaning. And it might be that they're leaning in this direction, that they will stand up and defend religious institutions, but they will not defend individuals. And I say that because just, a few weeks ago we had the decision from the Supreme Court involving Catholic Charities and their adoption work in the city of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia had refused to work with them because they would not place children in same-sex homes, even though they'd never been asked to do that. So it wasn't even a case. And the Supreme Court decided, it was again a narrow decision, but they did side with the institution. And I'm wondering if this decision is suggesting they're going to go in a direction of saying, if it's a church or a parachurch organization, then we will acknowledge your religious beliefs, but we won't extend that to the individual in terms of how he or she runs her business. And if that's where this is headed, I think it's really troubling, and it's probably the most discouraging news from the Supreme Court in quite a long time. So that's the second issue.
That's kind of a slippery slope too. Stop honoring the individual, it's not long to stop honoring the institution.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the next step would be parachurch groups we're not going to honor. And the last step would be churches. That would be the end of it all. But yeah. And again, I just point out to everybody that there is a First Amendment right to religious liberty in this country. And there's nothing in that amendment that says it's limited to institutions. It's for the American people that you have religious liberty to order your life and to conduct your life according to your deeply held religious convictions. And there is nothing like that related to the LGBT community within our Constitution. So our first freedom is religious liberty, and again, this is an example where that's just being thrown under the bus because of newly invented unconstitutional or non-constitutional liberties. So.
It's interesting that this doesn't apply in most cases to the Muslim faith. They're not attacking Muslim force, they're attacking Christian.
Yeah.
And the Muslim doctrine is at least as strict as Christian doctrine is.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not who they're attacking. They're attacking they're attacking the ones that are in power. It's that oppression and pressure idea. I don't know what I'm speaking. Oppressor, oppressed, there we go. It's that same divide, and the Christian is the oppressor and the other is not.
Yes.
So it really comes back to, I think John Stone Street said in that first article, one of the comments he made was, I don't have a problem with the race in critical race theory, I have a problem with critical theory.
Mm-hmm.
So when you take critical theory and there's lots of thoughts on that, they don't allow any arguments. I mean, critical theory itself doesn't allow someone, if you say your theory is wrong, that just proves that I'm racist and problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just part of critical theory. And so if you take away it's a flawed system. And John Stone, he said that it's not the race I have a problem with, it's critical theory.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can probably, if we were to brainstorm, we could come up with a lot of analogies. You know, arguments by analogy are not necessarily perfect arguments, but when the analogy is a good one, they're pretty powerful arguments. And so if we were to brainstorm, so for instance, imagine a cake baker, and he is African American perhaps, although wouldn't necessarily need to be that, and someone comes in and says, I want you to make a cake for our celebration of the Ku Klux Klan. And I think we would all say, well, no, that person has the right to say, I'm not going to make a cake to celebrate that. Or how about the Christian, well, let's say the atheist cake baker who's, maybe he's got on his door, you know, I'm a militant atheist, and you come in and say, I want you to make a cake saying, I want it on icing on the top of this cake, I believe Jesus Christ is Lord. And the atheist said, I'm not going to do that. Or the Christian cake baker who's asked to make slogans to Satan or to any number of issues. And, you know, they're all analogies of a sort, but I think a lot of us would say, well, no, you shouldn't force people to do that. And in all those other analogies, I think the person would be absolutely, there'd be no issue with saying no. But in this issue, it gets to the Supreme Court. So the other thing in the book I mentioned a moment ago, the Benedict option, he has a chapter on schools. He also has a chapter on work. And the gist of that chapter is that Christians really do need to start to have conversations, particularly young people, as they're considering their future and asking the question, do I want to go into this particular field? Or might I find myself in a field where I really cannot practice in the future? And so you go perhaps deeply in debt to achieve a graduate level degree of some sort. And do you really want to do that if it's going to put you in a position where you're going to have to make a choice between my career and my deeply held religious beliefs? And that's a new conversation, right? I don't think we've already had to have that conversation in the past, but I think we're going to have that conversation perhaps in the future.
I've done a lot of wedding photography over the years, and not in a billion years would I put my shingle out now advertising wedding services, because I don't want to be stuck in a position. So I do photography work, and it's all free and it's all word of mouth. Period.
Yeah, and by training, you're a nurse. And in the medical field, there are real challenges perhaps coming about, particularly on the abortion issue, but also sex change issues.
In nursing school, I was taught that you will never be asked to do something that it violates your conscience. So if you're asked to do something, if it's not direct harm to the patient, that you can ask to be reassigned, or, if there's no harm to the patient, you can wiggle out of it.
But see, those protections are being challenged, and there's real pressure to remove those protections. Again, where it'd be a dignitary harm issue. If you don't participate, you're doing harm to their dignity. Well, if you're forced to participate, doesn't that do harm to your dignity? In a really profound way, because you come away from it feeling deep shame and guilt because you violated God.
And I think on the state level, the federal, and even the military, the amount of classes that are being bombarded on people that work in those fields is going to continue to get increasingly more demanding on not just, okay, I got the training, I understand it, but do you agree? I think the military is going to be hit pretty hard with this too.
Yeah, and then we need to understand and make distinctions. I think in a lot of career fields, people are going to be forced to, if they're not yet, they're going to be, to have the diversity training. So someone's going to come in and do the diversity training, and it's going to be very much against the biblical Christian worldview. And so here you are as a Christian. You have to submit to this, and then you have to sign a piece of paper. If the piece of paper is just simply, I did diversity training, I think you sign it. But if the piece of paper says something like, I agree with what I was taught, then I think you can't sign it, right? And there would be a conflict where, your Christian worldview and your professional future are at odds with one another. And I think those kinds of things could come pretty easily in our culture, and I hope they don't. But I think we do need to be prepared for that and need to be having those kind of conversations with particularly our young people.
Yeah, we had diversity training back in the lead level of the course about a couple of people and men and women and so forth. So it's hard to believe that there. Now it's evolved into stuff.
Yeah.
John. Kind of go, Scott, the thing that's kind of been bugging me, besides all of it, but this whole thing that's going on in the military, it's one thing to do a diversity training, hockey or whatever, and you got to work on the floor with other people, and you've been told things, and now you're looking at each other funny. But it really concerns me that kind of thing doesn't work in the military, I wouldn't guess, because when you are assigned to go out and do a certain task, you all got to be on the same team. And if you've been spending time figuring out why your buddy isn't on your team anymore because of all of this oppressed thing going, I just don't see how it works there. I mean, on the factory floor, you can probably skate by, and if somebody makes a widget wrong, it's not a big deal. But if you go out on a mission, and you got that kind of nonsense going on in this situation, I don't see how it works without. And I'm thinking Putin and Xi Jinping, and they're all just going, come on guys, just keep going. Who's going to make our military leaders?
All right. Well, the third issue is, and I've got something I'll hand out to you in a minute. This is just one of the things that I'm asked quite a bit about is like, well, what do we do about all this? And I don't have the silver bullet answer to that. We all want the answer to that. What do we do other than we come to this class, we listen to these things, we inform ourselves in other ways, but what do we really do about this? And again, that's hard to say. But I do want to share with you, this is a real life conversation. And so this took place a couple of weeks ago in my study. And so I wanted to share this with you and then use this as to launch a discussion about what would you do and what would you say? Because this situation it's within family. right? And I don't know how many of you have family members who identify as LGBTQ. I assume some of you probably do. And with the way the culture is going, you know, it's become trendy now and faddish even to identify this way. So it's an issue. So the following is taken from a real conversation that recently took place in my study involving a family. So your sister identifies as lesbian. Your mother, who claims to be a Christian, has cut ties with her, and she is pressuring you and your other siblings to do the same thing. In talking with your sister, who also claims to be a Christian, okay? So it's a family where everybody claims to be a Christian. So this woman living in this lesbian relationship says she's a Christian. She asserts the following in justification of her lifestyle. So there were two things stated to me, and I was asked, you know, how would you respond to these? Number one, she states that animals exhibit homosexual behaviors, and therefore such behaviors are natural. If animals act this way, then humans should as well. And I'm just presenting this because this is real life, right? This is the sort of stuff that I hear in my study when people come to me and ask, you know, my relative is saying this to me. What do I say to this? What do I say to my mom? Should I cut relationships with my sister or should I not? You know, what should I do? And then second, her sister states that the word homosexual is not found in the Bible before 1947. And this implies that recent editors added the word to make the Bible a homophobic book. Now, it wasn't stated quite that way. That's my statement of it, but that's the gist of what the person was saying. In conversation with her sister, she's saying, well, I know the word homosexual doesn't appear in the Bible before 1947, and all of a sudden then the word pops up in the text. And so the editors, in her mind, have put the word in there to push an agenda against gay people. And so making the Bible something it isn't. And so how would you, I've got something to hand out before I do that. I'm just going to, a brief discussion. You know, on any of this, what would you say?
I've never seen a homosexual animal, but I'd also say animals eat their poop and they do a lot of really gross things, which, you know, that's just not it.
Cats will eat their babies.
Exactly.
Cat will eat it, so if my baby dies, should I eat my baby?
So basically, the argument you're making is that we should not determine right and wrong and what is right and wrong behavior for human beings.
And I've never seen two female dogs married.
Based upon what animals do.
I think
Okay.
humans are called to a higher intelligence standard than the common people.
So where should animals, or where should we look for our understanding of what's right and wrong? The Bible?
Yeah, it talks about the man, laying with a man. It doesn't call it homosexuality, but that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's there long before 1947.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, the Bible says that if someone is in error, to go to the steps, and then you have nothing to do with them if they don't. However, that is between fellowship. Here you're talking about your family member, and I think the right thing to do from a biblical perspective is to make it clear that you love that individual. They're your sister, your daughter, but you cannot condone the relationship, and that you want to be able to visit, but not within that relationship. You just have to basically put it on the board staff. That this is what we believe we cannot condone that relationship, but we love you dearly and want to keep the lines open. I couldn't reject a family member because of that, but I also couldn't condone what they're doing.
Everybody agree with with the gist of what Marilyn just said? Yeah. I mean, we can nuance that, but I think, basically that, I agree with that. There's a difference between, church and family. And so we'll say more about that, but yeah, several hands going up here, but as the hands are going up, could I have a couple of you just, like two of you, pass this out? If I divide it up here. I've got 50 of these, I think that's probably enough. But go ahead, Dawn.
Well, in one of our first classes, you talked about worldview and what our Christian worldview was, and I thought, can I make that into a 15-second saying if I come up in an argument or a disagreement between my worldview? And so you I might have this a little bit wrong when you said, I believe in God. I believe in God of the Bible. I believe the Bible. I believe that I'm a sinner, and everyone sins, and I believe that Jesus Christ is giving me eternal life and connecting that relationship with God. And I tag on to what you're saying. You can state your worldview, where you're coming from, and then they can state their worldview, where they're coming from, but not to break family relationship, but still clear the air where you're coming from. And I actually had that happen in a discussion with a good friend and stated my worldview, and she's very articulate, but she couldn't go any further after that was stated.
And so did she reject you, or did she accept you despite the differences?
She still accepted me, and it pretty much curtailed the discussion because she didn't know her worldview. She's very articulate, very sharp, but it made her stop and think.
Yeah.
And I also have a very wise sister that said, why don't you focus on Jesus and not on politics with this friend?
Yeah. Okay, well, let me just read here. After stating the issue that I've just stated with all of you, I write, it's always wrong to look away from God and to animals to understand personal morality. And while not an expert, and I'm not, I have read that such behavior in animals is not an expression of homosexuality but dominance. In other words, and a lion pride is a good example, because there are lion prides where you have more than one male. So you've got two males and say that's eight females, and you will exhibit, if you're watching, there are instances of where these two males are doing something that to an untrained eye you might think, well, those lions must be gay. But the experts tell us that's not the case. In other words, there is still an alpha male in that pride. And he is putting the second male, if you will, in his place. Because what does he want to do?
He wants all the hot chicks for himself.
He wants all the lionesses to himself. And so the behavior is not, it's possible for us to read human behavior onto animals. And this would be an example of that. So you see a male lion mount another male lion, and you think, well, there's gay lions in the world. And in actuality, what's going on is that alpha lion is sending a message to the beta male, I'm the boss here, and then I'm going to really prove that I'm not a gay lion because I'm going to go impregnate all the lionesses. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to me, right? I mean, that's not human behavior at all. But that is an explanation of what someone would observe that is saying to us, the lion is not homosexual. The lion is asserting dominance because the lion wants the lionesses. Okay? And again, I'm not an expert on that, so that's enough said. But I am pretty competent with, how to deal with biblical texts. And so in response to the second one of these, which I'd never heard this before, the word homosexual does not appear in the Bible until 1947. I'd never heard that before. I didn't try to figure out whether that's actually entirely accurate or not. I suspect it probably is, because, like the King James doesn't use this word. Of course, if you go back to 1611, I don't know, was the word homosexual in their vocabulary exactly? I don't know. I mean, they used other words to describe the behavior, but was this word, actually in existence? I'm not sure. I mean, we used to call, the biblical language was sodomites, right?
Check the King James does not have homosexual language, but the New King James does have homosexual language.
Yeah, but the New King James is from the 80s, I think. Okay, so we're talking about translations. So the best thing to do is just to remind ourselves of biblical words. And so we'll just spend a few minutes doing that. So I've got two texts, 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 10, and then 1 Corinthians 6, 9. And we're running out of time here. But the King James reads as follows: "But we know that the law was not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and for sinners, for unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for whoremongers." And we don't use that word much anymore, do we? Whoremongers. When's the last time you heard that word? I mean, it's an archaic word. "For them that defile themselves with mankind." Okay, that's King James language. "For them that defile themselves with mankind, for men stealers, for liars, for perjured persons, and if there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine." Okay? The ESV, the same text. "Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless, the disobedient, for the ungodly, for sinners, for the unholy, profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, and then men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine." So the most important thing here is to ask, well, what's the word or words behind the English translation? And so I'll give those to you, and I'll give you the lexical meanings. The first one is arson coitus, and it is a compound word. So as you see here in the note, the word arson means male, and koite means bed. So this word literally means a man taking another man to bed. Okay? And that's why the ESV translates as it does, men who practice homosexuality. The King James, "for them that defile themselves with mankind." Okay, that's a little bit ambiguous, but the idea is for a man who defiles himself with another man. Okay? So the meaning is sodomite. The sense is masculine homosexual, a male who commits sodomy with another male, sometimes of the active participant exclusively as opposed to the passive. So if this word arson coitus has a particular specific meaning, its meaning is that it is pointing to the active participant. This is painting a word picture. Do you understand this? Okay, I don't need to be totally indelicate here, but it is painting a word picture. A man who's behaving as a man in bed, there's another man in bed who's behaving as a woman in this relationship. It's painting that picture for us. Okay? The second one, 1 Corinthians 6, 9, the King James reads, "Know ye not that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind." Okay? The ESV takes that same verse and translates this way, or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality. Now, on this one, the King James, on the previous one, I think the King James, I think it's less effective than the ESV and less good. This one, I think the King James is a little bit better than the ESV, because the reason being, there are two words here. And the ESV doesn't really show that to you. It just says, nor men who practice homosexuality. You can't really read that and realize there are two Greek words behind that translation. Whereas the King James, you can see it. Nor effeminate, that's one word, nor abusers of themselves with mankind, that's another word. And so what are the words? Well, the first word is malakos, which means soft or effeminate. And so the sense of it is literally, if you just, I'm taking this straight from, my lexicons, okay? This is just straight out of the books, the dictionaries, if you will. An effeminate homosexual, a male who was the passive partner in a homosexual relationship, often of more feminine-looking men or young boys. So that's the first word that the King James has as effeminate. Now the second word is the word we already had, arson coitus. Again, meaning sodomite, and a male who commits sodomy with another male, sometimes of the active participant exclusively, as opposed to the passive. And so these are two of the primary words used in Greek that come into our English translations. And let me just read this next little part here. What this study of Greek words demonstrates is that Paul's vocabulary is far more expressive than the bland word homosexual. Paul's vocabulary describes the behavior focusing upon the sexual act itself. Such vivid language reminds us that such acts are contrary to nature. And so, okay, if we want to say the word homosexual doesn't appear in the Bible until 1947, what we also need to say is that the words the Bible actually uses are far more expressive of the word homosexual. They actually describe the nature of the act, and they do so in condemning kinds of ways. Now, I don't know how this helps you exactly. I hope it helps you, though. We do need to be prepared. I mean, I don't think you have to be able to say to someone, let me tell you about these two words. There's this word malakos and this word arson coites, and you got to memorize those words. But I think it is helpful for you to just be aware that when the Bible speaks about homosexual behavior, the language used is very specific. Paul uses a word that refers to the effeminate member in the relationship, and he uses a word that refers to the dominant male person in the relationship. And so the Bible actually uses language that's far more expressive than just our word homosexual. For us, homosexual now is just used as it's a word that describes orientation, right? You're heterosexual, you're homosexual, and there's no moral censor connected to the word for the most part. The language that Paul's using is there's morality connected to this language. Okay? Well, it does. Yeah, there's a lot of other passages we could look at. Yeah. Okay. Let me just read the end here. What do you say to your sister? I think that you express 4 points with equal clarity and compassion. Number 1, I love you. You need to say that over and over again. Number 2, I do not agree with Mom and very much want you in my life. I think it's worth saying that, not only to your sister, but to your mom as well. Number 3, I cannot accept your lifestyle because God doesn't. And number 4, if you are a Christian, because she claims that she's a Christian, if you are a Christian, your identity must be child of God and not lesbian. I mean, that really needs to be hammered home, because we've made all these orientations as their identities. And no, your identity is I'm child of God. It's not this other thing. All right? I also included here from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And I'll just read this as I close. I so appreciate this statement. I think it's very biblical, and I think it's helpful to us. Homosexuality refers to relations between men or between women who experience an exclusive or predominant sexual attraction towards persons of the same sex. It has taken a great variety of forms through the centuries and in different cultures. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. So in other words, the Catechism is acknowledging there is something called same-sex attraction. They're not denying that. They're saying it's largely unexplained. Basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. You understand the logic of this? It's against natural law. What does that mean? Sex is for marriage between a man and a woman in a committed relationship that is open to the gift of life. So marriage is connected to procreation. It's not the only purpose of marriage, but it is a purpose. And homosexual marriage, that's an impossibility. So it's contrary to natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a general affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can it be approved. So anyway, that's just an update of the last several weeks. And any closing thoughts? I know some of you have raised hands, and I didn't have a chance to take every hand that was raised, but anyone want a final thought?
The thing that we just hit on was something I was going to bring up earlier. Was, sometimes people get twisted up because they think you're shoving God down their throat. But I always fall back and read a lot of history, and the whole statement in our documents about the law of nature and nature's God, right? And I don't know if I figured that right, but I got the sense that maybe what they were doing there was saying, look, you may not believe in God as part of our founding background and structure here, but the laws of nature are also at work at the same time. And so you can pick whichever side you want, but you're going to end up in the same place. We have these same basic concepts that come out of it, whether you think it comes from nature or whether, because there were deists that wrote those documents, they had a different idea of how God operated than we do sitting here today. And so I think if there's the opportunity, and you feel that the God thing is going to turn them off, then direct them into the laws of nature and say,
Yeah, I think natural law as an argument might be more helpful to us in-house than out-of-house. I think I hope it has power with our own kids. I think it should be used out of house though also. But natural law is just based on the idea that there is an intelligent designer. And he expresses his designing intent in all kinds of ways. And clearly he expresses his designed intent in how he has made men and women and how it takes a man and a woman to produce a baby. And that's communicating something to us, and we shouldn't just reject that and turn away from it. Well, we should recognize that if the Creator has created me this way, it's a little bit like when you buy a device that needs to be assembled and you just say, well, I'm going to throw the instruction manual away because who gives a rip? If our bodies express intentionality, then we should listen to that, because he is the Creator and he does know what's best for the creatures whom he has created. I think there's power in that argument, and we need to find ways to make it. We also need to find ways to communicate to our children that the Christian worldview on sex, I think so often they hear only "thou shalt not." They need to hear God's way is the way. It is the best way. And Christian marriage is the best way. They need to hear that, and we need to do a far better way. We need to communicate that in a far better way, I think. So, all right.
Larry, you want to close?